Want to talk today about the issue of how we perceive incitement, that is, incitement to violence specifically, versus expressions of legitimate anger in a democracy. Now, this is actually not quite a black and white thing, um, because it very much depends on your perspective. So, what one person may consider to be incitement, another person will say is a peaceful expression of anger. For me, if I was to define this very, very loosely, it would be if someone's position entails threats towards an individual or a group, um, or if it is made by a person in a particular position of power, and I'll come back to this point, against a person or a group, and it's done in such a way that they know that it will encourage their supporters to act on it. I think that's how I would determine incitement. Now, of course, I'm not talking here from a legal perspective. I'm not a jurist. I don't know what the legal parameters of this is, but I'm just talking about my own opinion here. Um, because here's the thing: I feel that we hear a lot about civility in politics, and it has its place. I may make another video on this. It has its place. I don't dismiss it. It certainly has its place, but it has to be remembered: politics is adversarial by nature. So disagreeing and sometimes robustly disagreeing is um, is important. But then one has to know the time to not be so adversarial that you just look mean spirited. I'll give a little example of this. Alex Salmond died recently, the former First Minister of Scotland and former leader of the SNP. Um, and Unionists, I think, took a very good and balanced approach whereby they noted his death, they passed their condolences to his family, and that's the approach they took. But they did not gloss over the strong differences. Now, I'm not going to cry crocodile tears. I didn't like the man. And I do believe had he got his way, this country would have broken up. I also think his his hosting a show on RT was a disgrace. I don't have any time for any public figure who does that actually. Um, but I understand he died of a heart attack. He was 69. It would just look mean spirited if those of us who you know took issue with him were to sort of dance on his death, so to speak. Um, so that's where the civility aspect comes in. It's that expression: if you can't say anything good, don't say it at all. I don't entirely agree with that actually, because I think when a public figure dies, it is valid to have an analysis of their legacy. It may look like I'm going off track here a little bit, but I'm just mentioning this in passing. I think it's valid to have an honest assessment. It's like when Thatcher died, the Labour Party then under Ed Miliband um, made tributes to her, but they also were honest about the differences. And I think that's valid because I think it would be insincere for political adversaries to pretend that, all was good and everything was in agreement because it clearly wasn't. But 69 is comparatively young, and I, a death is a death. I sympathise with his family in that regard. Um, but his legacy is what it is. He was, I would describe Salmond as a very important figure in Scottish politics. Um, and, he dedicated his life to what he believed in. It just so happened that what he believed in, I strongly do not believe in, namely the breakup of the United Kingdom and Scottish independence. But anyway, back to the issue of incitement. Um, this has often been leveled against Trump, uh, specifically over the actions on January 6th, 2021. Now, Trump apologists might say he didn't actually literally say, go and commit violence in the Capitol. He didn't actually say those words. But I think this thing about incitement also, the person involved is also a factor in that because the more powerful, prominent, famous they are, the more influence they're going to have. So Donald Trump saying that is going to have a different impact than some random oath keeper from Kentucky or Minnesota, right? Um, when it's a former president of the United States, his words matter. This is the thing that I think a lot of Trump apologists don't get. Everything Donald Trump says, they take two responses. They either say it's fake news, or they admit he said it, but they don't think it's that important. Oh, it's just Donald being Donald. I would argue that what world leaders say does matter a lot. Um, Particularly a former president of the United States, he literally held the most powerful job in the world. So this idea that, oh, it's just Trump being Trump, it's I don't accept that at all. I think it's a very sloppy excuse because we know that there are Trump supporters who are deeply influenced by him that basically see him as a sort of messiah of sorts. I come from a Christian background. I don't say that lightly. Um, but there is definitely a personality cult at play in Trump's among Trump's core supporters, no doubt about it. So when he repeatedly lies that he lost the election, because here's the thing, even if he genuinely believed that, um, it was settled in courts. Every single case was thrown out. It was settled. To this day, he's a sore loser. To this day, he will not accept he lost. Why does that matter? It matters because every time he says that, that galvanizes his supporters. Not all of them. I'm not suggesting every Trump supporter is going to do what that lot done on that day, but there is a contingent who will. I don't think we're going to see the exact same thing again if Trump loses. Apparently, it's dead heat at the moment, which concerns me. I mean, that's just hard to fathom how, but that's for another video. Anyway, um, the point I'm making is when he taps into conspiracy theories, when he repeatedly regurgitates lies, when he constantly rails against his opponents, because I think it's pretty damn rich for Trump, Trump's inner circle to be accusing the Democrats of incitement. What have they said? They've said he's a danger to democracy, and they've said that they've pointed out things he has done. They haven't said go out and attack him. So likes of Donald Trump Jr. blaming the media and blaming the Democrats. It's just it's just false. It's just a false attribution. Um, the reason Donald Trump has faced violence against himself, which I condemn, is because he is a deeply polarizing figure. And in a country awash with guns, some of those gun owners are going to be on the left, right? And some of them are going to take that step further. I condemn it. I don't think political violence should be normalized. But blaming the Democrats for that is absurd, particularly when the first thing that happened was Joe Biden and Kamala Harris condemned it without any caveat. They condemned it. Biden even offered extra security. Contrast that with the way that Trump's side reacted when Nancy Pelosi's husband was violently attacked, or when Gretchen Whitmer was kidnapped, or I should say the kidnapping plot. Thankfully, it failed, but instead of just condemning it, Trump's people actually, no, Trump himself actually blamed Gretchen Whitmer for her governorship of Michigan. That is a disgrace. When Nancy Pelosi's husband was attacked, there were senior Republicans condemned it. Trump personally didn't. Disgraceful. So I think it is absolutely hypocritical for Trump's people to accuse the other side of incitement. This is not to say the Democrats are perfect. I do think during the George Floyd riots, Nancy Pelosi fanned the flames. So did other senior Democrats. Not Harris and Biden, but other senior Democrats did. So I don't say the Democrats are perfect in this regard. Um, the whole thing about defunding the police and, go out and make your voice heard and all this sort of stuff. Whilst riots were going on, I think was deeply, deeply irresponsible, reckless flame throwing. And yes, they should have been condemned for that. But that's the point I'm making. Just because Trump didn't literally say the words "go out and attack the Capitol," what was it he said? Stand by, right? He repeatedly said that narrative. He spoke about a peaceful protest on the Capitol, so he did actually encourage him to go to the Capitol. Um, and if what he says is true, that he's not responsible for that, why is it since then, instead of outright condemning those people, he has actually called them great American patriots who should be pardoned? So anyone who is in any moral uncertainty regarding Donald Trump, this is the sort of person we're talking about, who's willing to pardon criminals who attack the U.S. Capitol. because they done it in favor of him. So I would say absolutely 100% Trump is responsible for incitement and also responsible for justifying it since. Disgraceful. It's not good enough for him to say he condemns all violence or some generic nonsense like that. Jeremy Corbyn used to do the same thing. I don't accept that. When you're being asked about a specific event, saying that you condemn all violence is just it's a cop out, quite frankly. Now, more broadly on the issue of incitement, we know that during the summer, some of those arrested and jailed posted things online and they were accused of incitement. Now, I personally think if someone goes online and says, to their supporters, and some of them had quite a few supporters, like thousands of supporters, if they said, we need to burn down a hotel with migrants in it, um, I would say that is absolutely inciting violence. It's not good enough that 10 minutes later they delete it, knowing that they went too far, because in those 10 minutes people will have thought. And when you get, drunk people who have no responsibility for their own actions, and they go out and do that. We saw this with the violence. We saw what happened. That is directly putting lives at risk. Now, should they get the same sentence as someone who's actually engaging in the violence? Probably not. But I certainly don't think it's trivial, as some have suggested. Elon Musk gracefully distorted this. He said that in Britain, you go to jail for having an opinion. That's not what happened, and I think he knows it. That's not to say that our free speech laws or our free our regulation doesn't at times compromise free speech. I think we do have problems, particularly over the definition of hate crime. And, you know, I would watch this government very carefully if they try to bring any sort of de facto blasphemy laws, ostensibly to protect, to stop criticism of Islam. I think the left is more liable to do these things than the right. So I definitely would watch the Labour Party closely on this. But when we're talking about incitement, I think explicitly calling for an act of violence is very, very different from saying it's a disgrace that these migrants are in the hotels. That's an expression of opposition, of anger, and it's legitimate. Whether you agree with it or not, that is free speech. But going a step further and saying let's burn the hotel down is directly inciting mass murder, basically. So there should be penalties against that. But I'll use myself for an example, just in case anyone thinks I'm detached from the sort of issues I'm talking about. I feel very, very angry more often than not about our justice system. I had an email exchange with a representative of the Scottish Sentencing Council recently, as they have this disgraceful approach, and they cite research for doing it, but they have this disgraceful approach that criminals under the age of 25 will be treated as minors, under the age of 25, not under the age of 18. So theoretically, in Scotland, a 24-year-old thug will not get the same sentence as a 26-year-old thug. That makes zero sense. You could get married, you can drive, you can vote, you can have your own business, you can join the armed forces, but no, you're not fully functioning as an adult according to the Scottish Sentencing Council. And I told them what I thought of that. But I was constantly aware I have to get the balance here of not mincing my words, being blunt, expressing my strong disapproval, but not getting vitriolic to the point where it could be deemed abuse. Because that's another thing. Today, we're in a situation where, because there has been violence against public officials, the awful murders of Joe Cox and David Amos, um, there's understandably nerves among public officials that they may be subject to violence. But this is another thing. Abuse versus violence, and how do we define abuse? I think that if someone is in a position of power, quite frankly, they need to have tough skin. They need to expect some strong criticism. People are allowed to dislike them, to criticize them. I think that the red line is if you then extend that to actually threatening someone or maybe getting into vitriolic personal abuse. Now, when I was talking to this guy, I didn't like the sort of This was the back and forth I'm talking about. He was making excuses, and I wasn't really impressed by his approach. He suggested that I'd misinterpreted their position. I don't think I did. Um, that's that. But I had to be very careful to be as diplomatic as possible whilst being blunt and direct. It's not an easy thing to do, actually, when you're genuinely angry. I could have just gotten into a rant and said, you're a criminal sympathizer, and it was tempting, but they probably wouldn't have just replied again, so it wouldn't have got anywhere. Um, Not that it necessarily got anywhere anyway, but at least he knows there's at least someone out there that doesn't like the approach that they take. Um, I remember when the government's medical advisor during COVID, Chris Whitty, was accosted on the street by some men over vaccines and all the rest of it, and they got quite a stiff sentence because it was an act of public harassment. But looking back on that period, um, I do think a lot of the experts were a bit detached from the pressures that was putting on individual people. They were looking at it just from a medical perspective, important as that is. And I'm no anti-vaxxer, but I do think there were people who, in the medical profession and others, who kind of flippantly said, "Oh, well, it's just a mild sacrifice," or it's just, they downplayed the effect that that had on people's mental health. For example, if you had a family that was cooped up in a tower block during those months, that would have been really, really unpleasant. And I remember there was one medical expert, and she actually suggested, the masks are not effective. I suggest free layer masks. You know, um, that sort of flippant, oh well, I suggest you do this. It doesn't take into account that people who had asthma, people who had perhaps been survivors of sexual assault, where the attacker would perhaps be pinning their face down, that sort of thing. Um, One thing I did feel angry about, I didn't like the conspiracy theorists. I didn't like that they were just totally dismissing the whole thing. I think that was extremely selfish and reckless. But there was another extreme, which is those who were just sort of trivializing the sacrifices and trivializing the mask wearing and all the rest of it. I don't think we should ever go down that path again because I think it would bitterly divide society. And, um, there's mixed results on whether that was effective or not. It's not conclusive. Anyway, the point I'm making is when those guys attacked Chris Whitty, they went too far. But it doesn't mean that Chris Whitty couldn't be criticized just because he was an expert. You know, they shouldn't have gotten his face the way they did. But this is the problem, if someone is in public life, where is the scope to criticize them? I don't particularly like heckling, and I certainly wouldn't advocate that someone is hounded on the street, harassed as they're walking along. Although I must admit, I would be pretty damn tempted if it was Jeremy Kyle, but probably wouldn't do it. Just for purely for my own reasons, because I wouldn't want a criminal consequence, but I'd have no moral misgivings about it, put it that way. Um, but what I've just said taps into the point, doesn't it? Because that's the sort of things I feel strongly about. So can I really judge other people for behaving that way? And I know I do. I mean, we all have to ask ourselves, what are our red lines? If we feel so infuriated about something, so angry about something, would we draw a line? Would we say, no, we that's going too far. We shouldn't do that. I would say that basically, in the case of MPs, I think it's legitimate for someone to write a letter of protest. I disagree with your position. I won't be voting for you again, or even challenging them. Why have you taken this position? How do you justify this, etc. MPs can't reasonably say that as abuse. That is being held to account for the position that they're in, for the decisions that they're making about people's lives. Now, MPs at least are accessible. How do you complain about judges? I mean, one of the biggest problems in our justice system, as I see it, is the lack of transparency. What I mean by that is there's absolutely no public accountability of judges, none. Yes, they may be held to account by their peers, and yes, they can get in trouble for professional misconduct. That is to say, for example, they're messing around with one of the jurors, something like that. But there is virtually no way for the public hold a weak judge to account, a judge that is consistently soft. It's consistently passing down sentences that the public do not feel are worthy of the crime he or she is presiding over. What leeway does the public have there? None. You can't write and complain because all that will happen is it'll go to court's clerk. The judge will never personally see it. You know, they have no office that you can contact. So I would say judges are one profession, maybe more than any other, that are almost impossible to reach out to, unless maybe you're directly involved in the case. I would say there is no public scope to protest or complain about soft judges. In theory, you can write to the Attorney General of England and Wales, who can then write to the Court of Appeal to overturn a sentence for undue leniency. But the chances of that actually happening, and I know because I've tried and I've looked at the data on this, the vast majority of cases that are referred to the Court of Appeal do not change. So this is an area I think the public need a much, much bigger voice. I'm not necessarily suggesting an American style system where we elect judges. I think transitioning over to that would just take up too much time, and it's probably not the right time for it, given we have a huge courts backlog. So it probably isn't the priority. But I do think judges need to understand that the public are watching them, and the public are watching the decisions they make. Sometimes you'll hear judges say, "Oh, the public doesn't want this, the public doesn't want that." Yet they have a good deal of leeway. You know, judges will often say, "Oh, their hands are tied." There's truth in that to an extent, insofar as they have to stick within the maximum and minimum sentences. But where I take issue is they do have options of aggravating and mitigating circumstances. And more often than not, you'll see a situation where a criminal they've been a career criminal, right? One offence after another. And they appear before a judge, and the judge gives them exactly the same sentence, not an elevated sentence. I think, and you know, of course, they'll never admit this, but I do think that there are judges out there, too many, not saying all of them, but too many are ideologically soft. It's not a case of, oh, well, it have to be because that's the guidelines that they're following. I think they are ideologically soft. I would certainly suggest that the judge who presided over the Hugh Edwards case, I think that was a bit of establishment stooginess. I think that was a case of one establishment member, the judge, um, protecting was probably be the wrong word, but deciding to go lenient on another establishment member, Hugh Edwards. You know, what was the sentence? 7 years on the sex offenders register and a mandatory 56-week course. Many people would say, considering he was doing this for years, that is, viewing this disgusting exploitative material, considering he had direct connections with a paedophile, um, you know, it should have been a bit stiffer, at least a couple of years in jail. Um, because will that sentence deter him? Maybe, maybe not. The judge said, you know, your reputation is in shattered, um, is tattered. Um, anyway, I digress here. But the overlying theme that I want to put out in this video is if people feel strongly about something, I think they should be allowed to voice it. Now, let's be very clear. What happened in the summer was not protests, it was rioting, it was violence. Rioting, violence, and I would argue messing with the public the way to stop oil does is not protest. That's hurting the public. You know, those goons who set a car on fire in my city here in Sunderland, um, they weren't protesting. All they were doing was hugely inconveniencing and hurting the innocent woman whose car they set on fire, a woman who'd parked because she was going shopping. I mean, that's not protest. That's riot. And I think the media has to stop conflating violence and criminality with protest because that emboldens such people, not just the far right, but also eco extremists. Stop calling them protesters because they're not. They're criminals. By virtue of the fact, not virtue, but by definition of the fact that they're repeatedly committing crime and they've got no remorse over it. I'm going to wrap this one up. It's been a bit of a long video, but I think that there has to be a scope for people to express anger because goodness knows in this country there's plenty of reasons for people to feel frustrated. We have it a lot better than some parts of the world, but there are plenty of reasons for people to be frustrated. So part of democracy is people have to be able to voice how they feel about things, including anger. But the red line is going to the point of actually committing violence, um, violent protest, violent rioting, or threatening individuals. But frankly, I think there should be an allowance for saying you strongly dislike someone. Hell, even insults. I'm not saying people should go around insulting others, but I think that has to be differentiated from an explicit threat. So saying, for example, um, a Labour minister is, what have you, getting they get called some bad name, or Nigel Farage, or Ed Davey, or any other senior politician, they get called some unflattering name. Frankly, I think that should be allowed. It's not the way I would necessarily conduct things, but that's people have to be allowed to express dissent. And the thing about dissent, it's always not always nice and rosy and civil. The red line is when it's messing with the public, which is what just Stop Oil does, or when it's violent, which is what those far right goons were doing. And yeah, they were far right. I make no apology for saying that. Um, yeah. So incitement versus legitimate expressions of anger. Let me know your thoughts.